Hello there. My name is Max Kaminsky. I'm the director of the storytelling lab at Midjourney, and I'm going to be talking about creative AI and this framing of lensing the imagination that's been guiding a lot of my work lately. Currently, we're about 6 full-time researchers plus a handful of PhD students who are visiting over the summer. We're kind of an interesting group. We're a hybrid academic/industry lab that does a lot of paper publishing, but also a lot of work on things that are product-facing or intended to be sort of like shipped as products in the end. Before that was an assistant professor of computer science at Santa Clara University, so I've been doing sort of like academic flavored computer science work for a couple of years as sort of like a post-PhD researcher. My research focuses broadly on what we call AI-based creativity support tools, or CSTs. So in practice, what that implies is building software systems that kind of support human creativity in various domains. And this kind of requires activity on both the artificial intelligence and the human-computer interaction, or HCI, sides of computer science research. So I end up building systems that involve both machine learning and AI sort of backends, but also front ends that sort of intended to help users work in certain domains. My PhD was in computational media from UC Santa Cruz, and there I was kind of focused on what we call technical games research. The idea there is that we built a lot of AI-based tools for game developers, interactive narrative AI systems, things to kind of make creativity more playful and fun, and maybe more approachable in various ways. Sort of lowering the stakes of getting into these fields that are seen as creative or that are difficult to get into for people who aren't used to thinking of themselves as creative, but making it easier to sort of participate in these in kind of a low-stakes way for the first time. And as a result of all that work, I've done a lot in the past on AI-based tools for storytelling, for game design, and for poetry. The poetry stuff is my current sort of like side interest or hobby. I'm kind of a computational poet by habit. So yeah, this talk is broadly about human AI co-creativity addresses an HCI problem. We're looking at sort of the human-computer interaction of how we can get people to be more creative with computers, not just looking at how the AI itself can be more creative, but more predominantly at how it can sort of inspire or stimulate creative thought by people, kind of helping them to go in creative directions or ideate. Case studies here are going to be drawn from my work in my labs at Midjourney and at Santa Clara. My main focus across that work has been supporting storytelling and world building, mostly with LLMs and diffusion models currently. In the past, I've used a lot of what we call symbolic AI technologies, which are older, but we're not going to talk as much about those here. And I am going to try to answer a couple of questions that I think are often asked to me in this kind of context. Number one is, why do we need better interfaces for AI-supported creativity at all? Why don't we just sort of improve the language models or the diffusion models or whatever that underlie these systems until they are good enough to kind of guess what you want from a very vague specification of your intent, and not worry too much about how the user interface looks for it? And question two is, how do we design better human AI interactions to support creativity? So given that we've sort of taken it into our sort of like scope of action that we're trying to build these better user interfaces, how do we actually do that? And there's kind of this third tertiary question I'm not going to spend much time on, which is about how do we evaluate whether we're making progress toward these goals? OK, so let's jump right in. Why do we need better interfaces for human AI co-creativity? And a lot of this is going to be discussed in the context of Patchwork, which is a system that we sort of built as a research platform and shipped a couple of months ago. I think the first production version of this came out in, I think, December 2024, so like towards the end of last year. And this is actually a slightly old version of the user interface. But you can see that the basic idea is that you've got a sort of world-building canvas that a bunch of people can use simultaneously. There's both images and text being generated in the same space. You can kind of chain back and forth between them. So there's a VLM that can kind of tell what's inside each of the images. And you can sort of have it like start elaborating on details about the character in a particular image, generate portraits of a textual description. You kind of sort of spiral out from having an initial seed concept for your world. So like in this example, starships shaped like organs, to having more and more example images of characters in that world doing things and how they relate to one another and so on. So there's a lot of sort of features in here for helping a group of users to kind of collaboratively build up a shared coherent feeling setting in real time, the kind of thing that you might use as sort of the backdrop for a sci-fi novel or something like that. And then you'd kind of use that as an input to other storytelling processes. So it's kind of an ideation tool. And as you can see here, you might start with sort of a very basic like sort of text prompt. This is just kind of the premise for the world as a whole, starships shaped like organs. We don't like some of these images, but we like a few of them. So we maybe sort of select the ones that we like and delete the rest. We can start to sort of ask, OK, so like what's a character that might exist in this setting? And we get this protagonist, Tensha Hartley, who's got kind of this weird like organic tube-based helmet thing. We ask for sort of a counterpart to that character, like a foil. And so we get a character who's much more rigid and mechanical. And you can see that the actual textual descriptions of their personalities, which are sort of being LLM assisted, are being also like sort of visualized in these ways that sort of reflect those stylistic differences between their personalities. So the sort of like implicit conflict between these protagonists is sort of highlighted by both the visuals and the text here. And then we can start sort of using these as character references to render out more images of the characters doing things. So here's our main character, Tensha, flying a spaceship. And there's a problem with all of this, which is that language models are pretty good at generating material that responds directly to what the user has written, whatever that arbitrary initial phrase is, starship-shaped like organs or whatever the world premise you've got. But it's actually quite difficult to get them to generate divergent material or stuff that goes off in really wildly different directions given that same initial prompt. And people tend to put very similar, very short initial prompts into these systems because when you're faced with kind of a blank text box, you think of a few things by default, and so people tend to go for things like cat pirate. You see a lot of cat pirate worlds. So we actually did a study on this, kind of trying to validate our intuitions about this homogenization thing that comes out when people start using these language models for ideation. We kind of compared a non-language model-based creativity support tool. This is the oblique strategies deck, which I'll get to in a moment, with a language model in sort of these open-ended ideation contexts. We gave people two different tasks, kind of a product improvement task of like coming up with new ways to make a product better, and a sort of storytelling task of imagining the consequences of an unlikely scenario, like what if gravity just flipped upside down right now? And we had them generate a whole bunch of ideas using each of these tools as kind of a support system. We had them using ChatGPT 3.5, which is kind of the classical chatbot interaction that you're familiar with, and the oblique strategies deck, which actually this is sort of like a deck of cards created by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt, these artists in the 1970s, to kind of help them with like musical ideation and getting unstuck. So you draw a card from this deck. It's got an oblique phrase printed on it. It says something like "destroy the most important thing," and you're supposed to kind of like follow that advice in the context of your current creative project. And when we see people using both of these systems, kind of comparing them against one another, we find that, interestingly, ChatGPT-supported people do have more homogeneous ideas. They say more things that are sort of similar to things that other people have said in the same ideation task context. And this is really interesting because by trying to quantify this homogenization thing, you can start to sort of get at the fundamental problem with using these language models in a like sort of a predominant like sort of co-creative context, where the main thing that they're supposed to be doing is generating material for humans to riff on or to sort of respond to. Now, what's interesting is that this is true even though, A, people using language models don't actually generate more similar ideas to themselves. So they're kind of sort of controlling for this homogenization effect in their own outputs. They just can't see other people getting similar outputs. So it's kind of a driven by lack of visibility into the output space sort of problem. And we also find that people using ChatGPT kind of win on other standard metrics of creativity. So we see flexibility as in the number of like basic idea categories they hit becoming higher. We see fluency as in the number of ideas they generate becoming higher. And we see elaboration as in the level of detail in each idea they come up with being higher. So interestingly, ChatGPT seems to be supporting creativity in some of these ways, while also sort of getting at this problem of sort of collapsing everyone's ideas down into a narrower space than they would occupy otherwise across the collective diversity of the crowd. So this is really interesting, I think. And we tried to start getting at why this might be. My current argument is that this is actually a problem of information theory. I call this the dearth of the author. I'm kind of punning on Barth's death of the author, which is sort of this classic literary theory result. If we say something very simple, like tell me a story about a cat pirate to a language model that's like a sort of standard instruction-tuned language model, we start out with this initial user prompt, which is just a few words. And most of these words don't actually mean all that much to the language model. We've got like tell me, which is just like anything that would sort of be a story would fit into this. Cat pirate, like these are sort of nouns or adjectives that are very specific. But then most of this is just kind of filler content, so it doesn't sort of tell us that much. And then in order to sort of bring in more additional information to this process, we look at essentially the model training data that it's seen before, sort of randomness drawn from the random seed and the inference process and so on, and kind of combine all this together into a final output story, which typically begins something like, this is the story of Captain Whiskers. And Captain Whiskers is actually a character that you're going to see over and over and over again if you ask language models about these cat pirates, just because they have these very strong biases built into this implicit sort of bringing into the training data and the sort of background information they're already aware, like sort of familiar with or aware of into this story generation process. And so you end up with this actually being kind of an information ratio problem. If you look at this closely, when the fraction of creative decisions that's made by a tool's user is very small, there necessarily has to be additional information brought into the process. And most of that is going to be coming from the language model itself. So the same sort of corpus of training data that everyone else is sort of building their creative processes around. And this is what causes this homogenization of output. You start seeing the language model making very similar inference choices across very different creative contexts, as long as there's sort of initial seed information in the prompt that sort of pushes it into the same broad space. And this can actually limit feelings of ownership over the artifacts that people produce. One of the sort of standard results in the co-creativity literature going forward for the last like couple of years has been that people feel less ownership of the things that they come up with when it feels like the machine is making a lot of the choices for them. And the sense of ownership, I think, is actually a pretty good sort of like subjective proxy for this sense of the computer kind of taking over creativity or being more responsible for the output than the human themselves. This also interestingly applies to other forms of AI-supported creation via small user inputs, including image generation via text prompts, but also including, I think, a lot of other these standards like sort of text-to-image interactions that or text-to-whatever interactions that we're used to playing with today. And interestingly, this also implies the possibility of reversing the dearth. If this is actually a problem of informational ratio, of not having enough information supplied by the user versus what's being kind of brought into the process to make this large output artifact by the model, you can probably get more information out of the user, get more of that into the process, and kind of create an abundance of the author instead. If there's a lot more intent per bit of output, then you start getting this really interesting system of like, oh, trying to sort of like ask the user questions or get more information out of them so that they're considering all the choices they make in this creative process from more angles or more directions than they would otherwise. And I think this is actually where this sort of human-computer interaction framing of co-creativity comes in. It becomes really important to sort of essentially bring more human intent into the process in whatever way that you can. And how to do that becomes the sort of central problem of designing these systems. So you can also frame this problem in terms of people inserting similar inputs into the same models and getting similar outputs, right? And there's, I think, three broad sort of things or categories of solutions that are suggested by this. Number one is that if we look at the same models, we can start looking at using a wider range of models to try to avoid everyone sort of getting the same things out from the same sort of like basic ChatGPT instruction interface. There's actually quite a bit of difficulty here, in particular because many of these models are trained on very similar data sets initially, and there's actually a lot of synthetic data being used now, which means that other language models will have trained on ChatGPT outputs, which means they all kind of collapse into this having like sort of shared model voice that we talk about sometimes. We can also try to improve the diversity of model outputs directly, and there's a bunch of different strategies for this. There's with inference time strategies, which kind of involve sort of looking at the token probabilities of the next prediction over and over and over again, and making better choices as to which tokens to select based on likelihood or based on temperature or based on sort of models of what a human sort of author would put here next. And there's strategies like quality diversity that try to basically get the language model to produce lots of outputs and then kind of refine it towards outputs that are diverse but also high quality over time. And both of these are interesting to us. We've done some work on both of these categories, but neither of them is kind of the focus of my talk today. On the other side, we can try to not use the model to generate final outputs directly. If we change how we use the outputs of the model, for instance, by treating them more as sketches or as inspirations or as sort of like strange divergent materials, rather than things that are intended to be sort of shipped along to the user in the final form, then we end up with this sort of alternative framing of the outputs where they don't necessarily have to be that original as long as they get the humans thinking in the right directions. So I think this is actually quite interesting and is kind of compelling in terms of like how we design these interactions. But the one side of this problem that I'm going to be talking about the most today is actually the similar input side of things. One interesting way to address this with the text prompt-based interactions is to actually augment user inputs with chaotic sources of input from some other sort of context. You can, for instance, maybe imagine a system that draws an oblique strategies card and just uses that random oblique strategies card every time it does a generation to kind of push the language model further out than it would ordinarily go with the same input. However, there's actually quite a bit of problem with this as well. This kind of reduces user control over what they're getting out, and it actually kind of brings in these sort of inherited problems with traditional generative models that are often used for this randomness. To do sort of a brief digression, I've done a lot of work in my PhD especially on this sort of controllable chaos injection approach of, in the system called loose ends in particular, we basically use a constraint solver type model to start guiding stories towards favorable outcomes based on what the user has specified as their sort of storytelling goals for this overall sort of the narrative thread they're currently pursuing. So you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, this Where Are We Going panel, which has sort of the author goals, these like little traces of things that might happen next in the story. And at the bottom, there's kind of these suggestions for where the story might go. And you're kind of repeatedly clicking on these. They get added to these threads automatically in terms of like where they sort of match up or where they fit in. And the system is kind of guiding you towards possibilities that help advance these narrative threads. So this is kind of like a planning-based, constraint-based model of story, trying to help you figure out like what might fit into these like overall story structures that you're trying to build out. And this would be really interesting to bring in, I think, in some contexts, as a source of additional chaos or a source of additional randomness for these language models. The problem with this is that all of these planning sort of models are based on these actually really symbolic sort of like crunchy specifications of what a story looks like. So this is actually a violation of hospitality pattern that's kind of on the back end of one of these author goals. And you can see here that we've got like a sequence of events where the first event involves entering a town. The second event involves this character who's a guest in this town being shown hospitality by someone who lives there. And then this third event involves the host kind of harming their guest before the guest is able to leave, kind of violating this like hospitality practice or code. And authoring these is actually quite thorny, as you might be able to imagine. It's kind of got this custom authoring language that we built for just this purpose. And you can see that there's a lot of difficulty around both generating a wide enough corpus of these patterns to be able to cover a wide range of possible stories, but also around making sure that these are actually like authored reliably and are like effectively working as programs. So this becomes quite thorny when you try to apply it to these very open domain story contexts where we don't actually know what the user is going to type in as their initial seed prompt for this world definition. Trying to simplify this a little bit, we get to what we call abstract outlines. I did a little bit of work last year with a grad student on this sort of approach of generating a space of possible narrative beats that might happen in a story. So we have a sequence of beats, maybe 7 of them. Each of them involves like a certain sort of main function that it performs narratively. So this one might introduce a character, the next one might sort of like escalate a tension between 2 characters, the third one might resolve a conflict, et cetera, et cetera. And we can kind of use an answer set programming model, which is another constraint-based approach, to generate these outlines that are very, very high level and vague, and then kind of use that to condition the language model's textual generation process. And in this way, we can get out stories that are more diverse, sort of cover a broader range of possible story structures, and in general end up with, I think, things that are a little bit more like out there than language models would tend to do on their own. But at the same time, this has the same difficulties of having to author this sort of constraint-based model up front. And even though this is relatively simple compared to the previous one that we just saw, I think it's quite interesting to note that this still requires some ability to envision what might happen in a story and kind of delimit that space ahead of time. So if you want to be sort of like getting all the benefits of the language model's open-endedness for covering like lots of different narrative domains, then you might not want to sort of use this this approach of kind of specifying the story structures that can be possible up front and then using that to drive generation. Okay, so coming back to this slide, there's a lot of different sort of things we've tried in these different categories, but there's one thing that has not been highlighted quite yet, and this is also on the input side. And the difficulty that we see here is actually around these people giving similar inputs to the model, right? They always say the same like handful of things when they're faced with this blank canvas context. And so one thing we can try to do is just get people to put more diverse inputs into the model in the first place. If they specify much more elaborate and much more detailed initial intents, or somehow sort of we get more information out of them about what they're looking for, then we can actually sort of refine the stories or the outputs of the model much more specifically based on the things that that user is asking for. And so it becomes this problem of getting the user to say more about what they want. Now, this is actually really interesting. If we reframe this process of LLM-assisted creativity as a process of eliciting user intent so that we can push the creative process in more interesting directions, then we end up starting to look at this as much more of a problem of reflection or of starting to think about what it is that you want in the creative process. However, there's a lot of difficulties with this in practice. In particular, when we see people trying to express their intent in these co-creative interactions, we first see a lot of underexpression. Users by default don't actually specify most of what they're looking for or most of what they want from the model. They mostly try to, in as few words as possible, get across what they're saying. We've actually done a study quite recently on this. It's not in these slides, but kind of looking at the way that people interact with these chatbots. And we see that even when they're saying things out loud to us, the researchers, about their frustration with the outputs of the model or trying to refine or improve the outputs of the model in some way, they don't really reliably put that back into the text conversation they're having with the language model. And so even if the language model is able to like respond to these things or adapt to these things when told about them, the user is not fully expressing their constraints or what they're looking for. So this underexpression problem becomes quite large, actually. It means the model can't index on the information that the user is kind of supplying to us as a side channel, but that would actually be best to have in the interaction directly. We also see this problem of fixation. I think it's very common in machine learning circles to try to infer from whatever the user is doing, their actions, what it is they're looking for, what their intent might be. And with fixation, we see a really big obstacle to this kind of inference. The problem with sort of creative fixation in particular is that users in a creative process or a creative problem often tend to become focused on a very particular way of achieving their underlying goals or intents or whatever. And so that means that the solutions they're coming up with are often constrained by things they've said earlier in this interaction in a way that they don't necessarily have to be. The classic example here is in sort of like these alternative use tasks where we give people a few random materials and ask them to kind of assemble them into like a useful solution to some problem. They might get stuck on the idea of using like the brick as the base for the overall structure, but not think to like do something else with the brick or use it in like a sort of like totally discard it maybe. And these kinds of fixations cause people to perform actions or do things that are more restricted in practice than they might actually be like hoping to see reflected in the final output of their solution. So if we try to infer their intent, we might assume that they're requiring the brick to be used in this way, as opposed to sort of continuing to, from the machine's perspective, generate solutions that make alternative use of these items. And I think the biggest problem here is actually the problem of uncertainty. If you've ever done any kind of creative work, and I think most people here probably have, whether that's like writing a paper or giving a talk or maybe like doing sort of more traditional creative work like creative writing, creative art, whatever, we often see that it's quite difficult in the creative process to figure out what it is that you want. And you can even argue that the creative process is a process of figuring out what it is that you want. The whole thing with creativity is that you come to the materials or come to the blank page not fully understanding what's going to come out on the other side. And so this process of interacting with the materials, of writing, of making art, of doing music, whatever, is basically a process of determining what it is that's driving you to make this particular piece of art or this particular creative output, and trying to kind of, through the interaction, get closer and closer to what you are sort of imagining your creative goal to be. So this uncertainty is, I think, a really sort of fundamental problem for all these kinds of co-creative interactions, where it's assumed that we can initially specify up front what it is that we're looking for. The fundamental problem is that we don't actually know what we're looking for initially, and so we kind of have to build an interaction that draws that out of us. I think when you look at artists' practices or the things that they write about, like the writing practice, for instance, you see this documented quite strongly. A lot of it is about building habits, about building sort of compositions of tools, various ways of chaining tools together, and so on, to basically produce a creative process that draws out of you more effectively what it is that you're looking for. And I recently learned a term that I really like for this concept, the endocept. This comes from basically like Freudian era, like 1970s psychology of creativity. And it's kind of buried in this encyclopedia of creativity research-related terms. But the idea here is that the endocept is kind of this vague, fuzzy intuition in your head that's helping you guide your creative process or steer your creative process. But in a way that it's actually quite difficult to articulate or verbalize. It might not even be possible to articulate or verbalize this. And so this endocept, this thing where I know what I mean and I feel, but I can't explain it. This is, I think, the thing that sort of operates as the spark or the driver of human creativity in a lot of contexts. And being able to sort of harness this endocept effectively, elaborate it out into a more complete form or a more developed form, without kind of squashing it or replacing it with something else. I think this becomes the fundamental problem in a lot of ways. So a lot of the work that we're doing recently is kind of focused on this preservation and elaboration of the endocept. You kind of try to grab this vague intuition, help the user kind of get a hold of it, maybe start refining it or making it more specific, and kind of using that as a guide in this creative process to do what we call lensing the imagination. Revisiting our cat pirates again for a second, here's kind of a couple of standard cat pirate images. You can see these are all pretty like standard Midjourney outputs, right? You get like, there's basically like a different way of conveying the concept of a cat who is a pirate in each of them, but they don't tend to convey much information beyond that. And that's kind of by design, right? Like you don't want the system to go off in like totally wild directions every time you're looking for something like this. If you're going for cat pirate as your prompt, you probably just want like the most generic possible rendering of this concept. But I think we often want to sort of go deeper in the creative ideation process. And so this lensing the imagination framing is trying to help us get to things more like this. We've got a bunch of different variations here on this basic concept, and they all reflect different ways of looking at the concept of a cat pirate, or like what a cat pirate might mean thematically in a story. The snarling, bedraggled black cat pirate lording it over a crew of terrified mice maybe emphasizes like the cat as a predator, and the cat is sort of like this dominating creature in this like landscape of other creatures. We've got the cute, fluffy orange cat pirate sipping grog on a beach. And this is much more about like, my cat is cute and I want to see this cat reflected in a story, or maybe like a children's book or something like that. And then, of course, we've got kind of the sci-fi game concept, like gray armored cat pirate sort of peeking through a porthole with a gun. And this is the kind of thing that you might see in like sort of a, maybe a setting where cats are these cunning raiders of human installations, and you've got kind of this like interspecies war thing going on. And I think all of these settings are much more interesting to spend time in than the very generic cat pirate setting, especially given that they each reflect something different about this whole broad concept. And so getting people to go from that initial seed intent to something more developed or more elaborated becomes, again, the sort of like the thing that we're trying to build. Okay, so what strategies are we actually trying to accomplish this? There's a bunch of different things in the portfolio. We're a very sort of like prototyping-oriented lab, so we do a lot of like small sketchy versions of like different interactions that might help us with this. But I'm just going to kind of walk through a bunch of them very briefly here. And just as a reminder, this all takes place in the context broadly of this Patchwork interface initially. A lot of them are kind of built in as features of this experimental like sort of world-building canvas platform. There's a few interfaces that are getting like more separated from this now, and we're going to talk about a few of those as well. But a lot of these initial ideas are sort of expressed in Patchwork in some way. The first idea that we're really interested in is in tightening the feedback loop between distinct creative modalities, things that are typically seen as like separate domains in the creative process, or things that are not executed by the same person directly in the same space. In the comics creation process, you see a lot of this, right? This is kind of a caricature of that process, but you see here that we've got like a few different stages that the sort of overall creative concept has to go through in order to be developed into a complete comic book at the end. There's often an editor who's kind of managing the overall storyline or sort of the main characters of that storyline and what they're going to do next at a very high level. You've got the writer who sort of writes an individual script for an individual issue of a comic. That maybe gets sort of developed into art by the penciler. The inker then sort of like does a more like refined version of the line art. The colorist and the letterer, who are traditionally, I think, separate roles, but now getting kind of merged a lot more, kind of do like touch up and additional details on that art. And as you try to sort of work through this process, it becomes very difficult for the later levels of this sort of process to feed information back to the earlier ones. So you end up with it being kind of a planned in advance by the writer and especially the editor kind of situation, where it's very hard for the information that's sort of emerging in the panel creation process to kind of feed back up to the script writing level and kind of work in this sort of complete creative loop. And this produces what Scott McCloud, who's kind of a notable theorist of comics, has talked about as a sort of divide implicitly between the writer and the artist in this sort of overall like process of producing mixed textual and visual outputs. They're both sort of experts of their craft, but because they're experts, they've kind of gone in these very extremely different like sort of directions of development creatively, and trying to make these two sides meet in the middle becomes quite difficult. So I think one interesting thing about creative AI is that it actually gives people who are not necessarily experts in one of these sides or the other the ability to sort of like rapidly iterate on both aspects of this. So you might not necessarily have this sort of conveyor belt model of going from the initial concept all the way to the output as the art at the end. You might have somebody who's more of a writer working with this model as sort of an art producing thing to kind of get rapid sketches on the concepts and how they might be visualized, and then kind of using that for fast feedback or being able to sort of give more information to themselves about what it might look like ultimately in the end as a visual, so that can sort of like feed back into the writing process more directly. Or alternatively, you might have an artist who's kind of using a language model for character ideation to kind of get into the heads of their characters, maybe talk to them in a dialogic way, et cetera, and kind of using that to get information about, well, I'm an art-driven person, but I want to know what happens conceptually or what might happen narratively in this story. And so I think being able to sort of use these models as ideation tools in those contexts creates a really interesting dynamic where you get these faster feedback loops than you might otherwise. This is also something where I think the complementarity of the artist's expert creative practice to the things they're not an expert in starts to come into really strong play. When we've done interviews, and I think this is especially true of visual artists, I think many of them are very skeptical of having an AI generate art for them, right? Because they enjoy the process of making visual art. They really enjoy sort of the craft of like laying brushstrokes on the canvas or using their favorite software or whatever. However, I think they're much more receptive in general to using a chatbot to talk to their characters because they're typically not text people. They're more okay with having something that kind of helps them with the side that they're weaker on or that is somehow complementary to their current practice. And writers, I think, feel similarly often about the visual art side of things. They'll use it for like this kind of fast sketching of like trying to lay out a scene without necessarily being experts in visual art and without necessarily even trying to use that as the final output art, but just as a way to kind of get additional feedback on that side of the process. So again, all of these things kind of help reflection in a way that is really compelling. We also see a move towards breaking up AI-generated material for better decision granularity. This concept of decision granularity is one that I've been thinking about a lot lately. The basic idea here is that in the human-computer interaction loop, we often assume that there's a sort of gulf of execution, which is the sort of gap between going from a thing that's in your brain to a thing that you've actually done or executed on the page. And the gulf of evaluation, which is sort of going between looking at what's sort of already on the page or already on the canvas and sort of figuring out what to do next based on that feedback. And so this loop of sort of the execution evaluation sort of cycle becomes something that becomes quite long by default in these text-to-whatever interactions. You often sort of type in a prompt, get out a very large thing that you then have to evaluate, and the evaluation gap sort of predominates, making it kind of hard to figure out based on like this massive novel or massive set of images or whatever that's been generated, how to change or refine your intent to kind of come up with better outputs. So I think by taking the AI output and sort of breaking it up into these smaller units, where we can sort of more frequently ask the user to make smaller decisions about what they sort of like do and don't like, we can achieve this better decision granularity. And there's this paper by Dan Bushek that came out a couple of years ago called Collage is the New Writing, where he talks about how in these AI sort of like research contexts especially, we see a lot of writing support interfaces moving less and less away, or moving more and more away from the sort of like standard linear document that people are writing, and towards something that's much more collage-based, where you have like lots of little scraps of paper, each of them has some words in it or some images or whatever, and you're kind of like shuffling around these very small units of text and making choices about them on a very like granular level, as opposed to kind of editing a single linear document as you traditionally do in writing. And I think he talks about a lot of interesting reasons for this. One of them is that collage is kind of a writing practice that has been arrived at by a lot of experimental writers in the past in various ways. But I think a lot of it is also about this decision granularity problem of trying to make it so that like when the AI generates material, it sort of naturally fits into this sort of like messy collage of scraps. And you can start to sort of make choices about them individually as opposed to having to make these all or nothing choices about large amounts of AI output. A third thing that we're trying to do is actually ask users open-ended questions explicitly to help them clarify their intent. When we look at this sort of patchwork interaction where you're sort of like generating text and generating images, it becomes very easy, I think, to just kind of like let the system take the wheel and produce lots and lots of AI stuff that's not particularly good, unless you're being sort of like stopped or slowed down at certain points to think more reflectively about what's going on. So we have the standard test prompt, the cold emu war, that we kind of use for ideation testing in Patchwork. And the cold emu war is usually implicitly realized by the language model as a war between humans and emus that takes place in someplace cold. It's kind of a reference to the actual Australian emu war, which happened in the Australian outback. But this is sort of a very basic concept that I think tends to get elaborated by the language model in very similar ways. However, when we started introducing these open-ended questions to this interaction loop, we started seeing people going in a lot stranger directions with it all of a sudden. We actually got the language model to generate this initial question, what unexpected alliance forms between emus and humans during the cold emu war? And so this is already kind of deviating from that basic idea of the emus and the humans being the factions that are at war. It's kind of implying a greater scope conflict where the humans and the emus are merely two like sort of participants in it, and they actually form an alliance in the end. This kind of gradually led the sort of like playtesters here to the development of this character Talon, who's kind of like the focal protagonist. And Talon is actually a bird, I think an emu. And so we're starting to focus now on this bird protagonist rather than on the humans who are typically sort of focalized in these stories. And then, because this question is being asked by the system about Talon and his childhood sweetheart, it starts going in this like weirdly romantic direction. And there's kind of like this romantic tension around Talon and this other character, Willow, who have kind of diverged in their like life paths and ended up on opposite sides of this war. So this is a concept that was again kind of brought in like once the players had sort of introduced this sort of like second character of Willow. What fate befell Talon's childhood sweetheart Willow after their paths diverged? Does she now serve the owl, or does she remain true to the eagles in her heart? And so this is going in like a really weird direction compared to the usual versions of this story. We see all kinds of strange things happening, and because people are being more frequently asked to sort of just give open-ended text responses to these like really weird questions, you see the story going in directions that it might not otherwise. So I think this is really interesting. A sort of further refinement of this concept involves refining user intent via examples directly. Once you kind of know what your basic character is supposed to look like, you might be able to, for instance, generate tons and tons of like small variations on that character. Maybe the character in like different settings, different lighting conditions, from different camera perspectives, whatever, and then have the user manually just kind of like really quickly pick out which of these variations are reflective of what's in their head. And this kind of fast refinement of intent process is, I think, really interesting for convergence. Like once you've got a very basic, like sort of definition of a character, you can start to very quickly pick out like this is what they do look like, this is what they don't look like, this is what they do sound like, this is what they don't sound like, etc. And by having the system kind of generate lots and lots of different sort of like wide-ranging directions that this could go, you can start to produce an interaction that overall like causes the player or the user to sort of make more choices about how this character is portrayed in different scenarios or different settings. Okay, when you're asking these kinds of questions, I think there's a threat that often emerges, which is the threat of kind of overwhelming the user with too many questions or questions that feel kind of irrelevant or misleading. And so we're starting to do a lot of work on what we call gauging creative momentum. There's a sort of a fundamental research question here of like, given that the people are doing these certain actions or these certain things, how much can we infer about whether they're currently in a divergent or a convergent feeling mode? Whether they want to see stuff that's really out there and wild, or whether they want to see things that are like sort of focusing down and narrowing in on something more specific. And also, do they want to see more output from the system at all right now? Or do they just kind of want to like work in peace until they invoke the system manually again? And so being able to, I think, to sort of like dynamically take the lead or take the following position in these co-creative interactions, this is something that comes quite naturally, I think, to human co-creators, and especially ones who have been trained at all in like improv and these kinds of creative forms. However, the language models are not typically quite good at this by default. There's often sort of this assumption in the way that we chat tune them, for instance, that there's going to be like a one response for each sort of user query sort of back and forth. And the responses are typically much longer than what the user is sort of asking for initially. So you get this kind of like slightly asymmetric creative dynamic, and the model tends to be more intrusive or more sort of like dominating the interaction than you want it to be. So we start to look at things like how many unanswered questions have actually currently been asked by the AI relative to how much material is already on the board. We can kind of look at like these raw counts of like these open-ended sort of question scraps that have been generated, and sort of compare that to how many sort of like real text or real images that are kind of like currently dominating the interaction. We can look at things too, like are users currently like sort of active in the sense of like fiddling around with the mouse or like doing stuff randomly with the interactions, but not really substantively modifying what's on the board. So are they like sort of just kind of playing around with the tool, but not really sort of making forward progress in some sense? And of course, we can also see that users might be currently focused on different aspects of the world. They might be currently making lots and lots of edits to a single character definition. They might currently be sort of obsessively changing the same text over and over again because they just can't quite get it to feel right. And in these cases, we might sort of realize that fixation or tunnel vision is kind of ensued. So it might be good to intervene elsewhere to kind of ask a question about a different aspect of the world or kind of refocus the user's attention to kind of draw them back out of these fixations. And of course, the threat of all of this is kind of hanging over our heads, which is that this feels kind of like Clippy if it's done poorly, right? So like the specter of Clippy kind of haunts all of human-computer interaction. Lots of people in the research community still respond to it in this like sort of very visceral way. And so I think when you look at this sort of like gauging of creative momentum, it becomes very important to calibrate this correctly to make sure it doesn't feel intrusive or unwanted in the same way. Okay, getting into more experimental interfaces now, we're going to sort of see some very gnarly, like airplane cockpit-looking things for a bit, because these are all research prototypes. This one is called Patch View. The idea here is that we're trying to basically make it so that you can sort of plot out all of the different elements of your world in these sort of semantic lenses where we visualize the relationships between characters and factions and so on very dynamically, just kind of using the language model as a tool for reflecting back at you information that you've implied about the world. So here we have a way to kind of specify these semantic lenses where you've got on the left-hand side, I think a traditional sort of like Dungeons and Dragons, like good and evil, and then like law and chaos axis or something like that. Actually, I think this is slightly different. This one is, okay, so we have people who are strong at magic, weak at magic, and then another axis which is like strong physically, weak physically. And so we kind of have the user put in these like sort of arbitrary concept magnets. And then we sort of auto-plot out where all the characters in this system or in this story kind of like fall on these two axes. And you start to be able to see like, oh, there's kind of a gap in the expressive range here. Like there's very few characters who are both like weak at magic and weak physically. And so if we create one of those characters by sort of clicking in that part of the space, we might generate a character who's like I think timid scullery maid who's like really interested in magic and really sort of like interested in being physically strong, but is not actually all that like sort of effective in either dimension. And then if you want to kind of change these characters, you can start to like sort of grab one of those dots, drag it around on these lenses, and have the system kind of suggest a rewrite that moves them to the new place in the semantic space. So being able to kind of like directly visualize and sort of like add to and sculpt this space of possible characters or space of possible interactions between them becomes this really interesting like alternative authoring channel. And we see people doing really weird things with this. One thing we see is that if they define a bunch of different lenses in parallel, they can kind of lock down where a character falls on some of these. So like, let's keep this person's good-evil positioning, but also make them much closer to a faction that we currently see as kind of evil. And so we end up with a character that sort of gets synthesized as having like sympathetic reasons for being a part of this evil faction, which is kind of cool. But we also see people doing things that we really didn't anticipate. In the user study for this, one thing that we saw was people creating a timeline where the magnet on the left side was the end of the story, the magnet on the right side was the beginning of the story, and they kind of auto-laid out the events of the story like along this timeline, having the system kind of gauge where these different like sort of events that happen should fall. And then started to sort of like add to things in the middle of the story by clicking somewhere on that timeline and having the system synthesize for them, here's an event that might happen between these other two pairs of events. And so I think you start to see these really sort of like wild sculptural interactions where people are providing intent in these channels that are not necessarily traditionally textual or that are very hard to express through text alone, but where the spatiality starts really helping to kind of get at vague or otherwise like sort of hard to define aspects of intent. kind of pushing further in this direction, we've done a lot of work recently on providing model steering controls beyond text in general. On the left-hand side, you see Tailbrush. This is a system that someone currently working on my team did during his PhD. The idea here is that you kind of draw an arc, which is kind of the main character's fortune arc in this story. And we generate via a language model a story that kind of follows this arc. So you see the main character's fortunes kind of rising and falling over time. They start out having kind of a bad time. In the middle, they're on top of the world. And then towards the end, they kind of like fall back down to even worse than they were when they started out. So this is like one of those traditional story structures that Kurt Vonnegut has sort of plotted out in some of his graphs of story structure. We've kind of extended this a bit in Patchwork. We have this experimental arc input interface where you can not just kind of draw these arcs, but also assign them very like general open-ended textual concepts that they're sort of attached to or rendering. So in addition to having like the arc of fortune for a particular character, you might also have the strength of a character's relationship with another over time and kind of vary that parametrically. And then also maybe like vary the seriousness of the narration or the overall emotional tone of the story or these kinds of things. And by combining lots of these different arcs together, you start getting the language model into this like really over-constrained space where it's trying to produce a system, or it's trying to produce a story that kind of matches all of these at the same time. And this does tend to get it into more interesting spaces than I think it would go on its own. Kind of analogously, we've done a lot of work on the image side with style references and kind of trying to let people provide these more imagistic or more visual ways of specifying what they're looking for in the like sort of output images that come out. And so you can start seeing things that are very different from the default sort of like image model outputs, but sort of like controlling towards these style vectors in style space. So again, there's sort of a complementarity here between the text and the visuals, and being able to specify visual things visually and textual things textually, as opposed to having to run everything through text, I think produces much more interesting outputs a lot of the time. The most advanced version of this gestural thing that we've done recently is a system called Toyteller that you can see on the left. The idea here is that you've actually got two different shapes, these kind of triangles, and they're kind of mapped to different characters in an interaction. And you start being able to kind of drag them around to kind of physically indicate, as if you're playing with toys or playing with action figures, the nature of their interaction. So you have them sort of like run over to chase one another. You might sort of like have them overlap for a bit, which could be interpreted as like they're hugging or something like that. You might have them kind of fight by like sort of smashing them together, and so on and so forth. And this adapter model that we've trained that kind of looks at these motions and maps them to sort of an extended space of language model tokens is then kind of used to steer textual story generation based on these gestures that you're doing, which can express really interesting, ambiguous, or overlapping intents. One thing we saw that was really interesting in the early testing was that there was sort of like a person trying to express an interaction that felt like kind of like chasing and kind of like flirting. And they kind of did a gesture that was sort of like an overlap of how they interpreted those things gesturally. And the system actually picked up on that quite sharply. It figured out that there was kind of this ambiguity in the like which gestural categories this falls into, and was able to kind of reflect that back in the narration. So again, here we see this sort of strong complementarity between the overall sort of outcomes that we get like from just having the text that you're writing, having the gestures that you're doing, but then also kind of like having the gestures shape the text in this way that makes it like sort of go in places it wouldn't go otherwise. A few more interfaces I'm going to step through. This one's called Reverger. It's basically about designing for explicit divergence and convergence phases in the creative process. Divergence, again, is kind of trying to go wide, cover lots and lots of different ideas that are very like out there. And convergence is kind of like bringing things back together, making them sort of fit into a sort of uniform single output. A lot of systems, I think, are good at one or the other, but not as much at both. So here we were kind of playing with this idea of the mutant shopping cart, where you take an initial textual story definition, you kind of generate lots of different directions or dimensions along which it could be changed. You let the user kind of drill down more deeply into each of these dimensions. So maybe we've got this initial sort of like fable that we're sort of like messing with as a material. We ask for ways to change it emotionally. We go for like, let's make it sadder, but then specifically like sad in kind of a melancholy, wistful way, as opposed to sad in like a like depressing way. And these sort of like tonal specifications and like specifications of word choice and word origin and things like that can then all kind of be brought back together in combinations that the user has found like appealing. So they go off in lots of different directions, explore the space of possibilities, and then kind of like have the system help them sort of smush them back together into a final output that is more reflective of all these different dimensions of variation they've now considered. And this, I think, is another sort of like really interesting loop for trying to get more of that abundance of the author in there, of like considering the output from a lot more different angles than you otherwise might. And then we've got this thing called Phraselet that we've actually been testing with like actual published poets recently. This is a really fun system. Again, very like airplane cockpit looking, like complicated interface. But the basic idea here is the text on the left is kind of the initial poem or textual material you're working with. And then on the right-hand side, you've got tons and tons of these lenses, or what we call phrase wells, kind of using the metaphor of a paint palette, that can sort of generate alternative phrases or phrase variations based on the text that you've highlighted on the left-hand side. So you might, for instance, specify, like, I've got this single word. I'm going to make an inlet at that word, which is kind of a way to sort of tell the system I want to change this part of it. And provide constraints on that inlet that are maybe like, this has to be drawn from a certain part of the language model's possibility space. It can't be something that the language model thinks is super likely, but it also can't be super unlikely. And then you maybe combine this with constraints from other phrase wells where, like, this has to be using Spanish language origin words, or this has to be using words that might appear in, like, works by Walt Whitman or something like that. And you kind of smash all those together and get these really complicated constraint sets that kind of change the interaction of working with the language model from changing from generating these very, like, long sentences or long passages to things that are much more tightly constrained, and especially using kind of symbolic constraints. Here we can even see that you can do things like sound constraints, where it has to, like, rhyme with or sound like a certain sequence of syllables. You can do things where it has to sort of, like, use certain word patterns, so like a verb followed by a noun. Things where it has to be generated in a certain persona or voice. Maybe like a skateboarder who's over it and wants you to just pick a word already. And when you start combining all these together, you get things like big ol' staircase, plus a bunch of constraints, being translated into mammoth decay trod. And these phrases are, like, really out of left field, things that a language model would not be expected to produce on its own usually. And only by really aggressively constraining the sampling process in these artistic ways do we get to these like, very evocative poetic phrases. Mammoth decay trod is just great to me. It implies, like, oh, there's this gigantic staircase that's, like, kind of, like, falling apart. And it's, like, really heavy to walk up, and, like, the character walking up it is maybe, like, sort of plodding along as if they're an elephant. Just, like, the connotations there, I think, are very rich and poetic in a way that I don't think you would have arrived at if not for having this, like, system that generates very short passages of text being used in this, like, heavily constrained way to get there. Okay, how do we know if it's working? I've already talked about this to some extent, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But number one is this homogenization analysis approach. You can just kind of look at the embeddings of the individual outputs that come out of the system. And then, like, especially when you look at the user-shaped or user-touched outputs, sort of see if users are producing outputs that are similar to one another's or more dissimilar over time. More specifically, you can start to look at what we call the expressive range of all the outputs the system has produced or can produce in a similar context, and start plotting individual users' artifacts as an overlay on top of this to see if they're all falling in the same place. So here we actually have a poetry system that I did back during my PhD. Each of these 4 different colors represents a different user. So the person with the red dots is, like, one person creating poems, orange dots is a different person creating poems, etc. And we see that they each kind of gravitate towards a different corner of the overall space of poems that are possible with the system. So people are actually kind of developing distinctive poetic styles or poetic voices over time as they use this. We even see that they're kind of avoiding the center of mass of this expressive range and making artifacts that are very atypical or unlikely by the system's, like, sort of definition. So it's kind of the, like, sort of bright white center of mass of, like, this is what the system produces on its own without a human shaping it. But then a lot of these outputs end up being very far flung or ending up at, like, really wild corners of the space, which is kind of interesting. And then per user trajectories can even help you see, like, over time, this person is kind of coming up with poems that are more and more drawn from the end of the textual material they're working with, but also using words that are less and less likely to appear in poems from the language model's perspective. So you get this really interesting sort of trajectory visualization dynamic. And then you can even compare these trajectories to see things like, oh, everyone kind of starts zigzagging back and forth between, like, a home region they've picked and more sort of, like, boundary pushing, like, sort of expansive texts that are outside of that. So the zigzag pattern is really interesting, and we're going to talk about that in future work especially. I think one more interesting channel to look at here would be actually quantifying intent elicitation directly. So kind of trying to measure, like, when we ask the user a question about their intent, or, like, sort of give them a bunch of examples that they can use to refine their intent, how rapidly are we gaining information that we didn't have before about what they're looking for? This is something that's actually quite vague and hard to define, but we've done a bit of preliminary work on it that's getting published, I think, in a couple of months here. And so I think we actually have some interesting leads on how to frame this correctly. Let's talk about that more in the questions part after, maybe. But yeah, I'm just going to sum it all up very briefly. Language models right now are not very good at being creative, right? They've got these problems of unoriginality and uncontrollability that make it hard to kind of work with them as this sort of creative ideation partner or creative ideation assistant. At the same time, co-creation with an LLM can be fun in its own right. There's kind of these, like, fun interactions you can build around world building with them, around kind of using them for, like, character concept ideation and so on. But it's hard to get people to take more creative responsibility for these outputs because of these problems of underexpression and fixation and uncertainty around their intent. As a result, we end up wanting to build these co-creative systems that kind of elicit intent interactively, that ask you questions, that kind of help you figure out what you want, help you kind of reflect on your own creative process or your own creative goals, and get you to some place that you wouldn't necessarily go otherwise. And in order to achieve this, we kind of need like a trifecta. We need novel UI on the front end to make these interactions more possible. We need novel AI on the back end to actually support these interactions. And of course, we need novel evaluation methods to make sure that we're actually going in the right directions on all of these things. OK, so yeah, if you want to read more about any of this, I have a bunch of publications. They're all visible at this website. You can email me via the link on there as well. And of course, we've got even more coming soon. So thank you.
Hi. I'll get started with a question if nobody else wants to. Thanks for the talk. So when you're talking about user intent, it actually strikes me that there's a lot of different things that you could mean by that, especially when users don't know what they want. So in your sort of mind, is the end goal of these systems to make like the best version of the user's intent, or the most creative, or the one they feel best about? Does that make sense as a question?
Totally, yeah. I think these questions of intent are actually really complicated and thorny, which is one of the reasons that you see these ambiguities arising. Intent is a very fuzzy thing in creative context in particular. Like that endo set that we talked about is like kind of textually undefinable, basically, but still something that kind of like shapes what people do or don't want to see. And I think the intent also drifts around a lot as you like do this creative process, right? Like the iteration loop kind of like takes you places that you're unexpected to, like didn't expect to go or are surprised by or whatever. But I think generally I'm most interested in things that feel resonant with something that someone like would endorse on their own, that sort of like feels like this would be my creative output in some sense, but also that they wouldn't think to create with just the materials available to them initially. And so that kind of like reshaping or like sort of what you learn about your own intent through the process of interaction, I think that's kind of the key to me.
How are you injecting this extra information into the LLM? Is it like prompt injection, or are you generating extra features, extra vectors that you're able to put in there to generate this output?
Yeah, so almost every system that I talked about in that like second half of the talk uses a different combination of strategies for that. A lot of it is prompt engineering because that's the easiest thing to play with, but a lot of it is also for the adapter models that we showed in Toy Teller specifically, the one where you're kind of like wiggling those shapes around. We actually trained a separate model on a data set that one of our team members had collected during her PhD on what we call the Hydersimul interactive theater, where we get basically, they sort of like had people like wiggle these shapes around to kind of like create a gesture based on a story they were being told. And sort of like vice versa, try to predict what other people's gestures were meant to indicate. So that data set was kind of used to train a very small model that kind of injects additional sort of like soft prompt tokens into this context window, and that kind of like shapes the way that it comes out with different expressions. And then like Phraselet in particular is like a really aggressively inference time sampling based interface. So we look at like logic probabilities, and we look at like sort of traditional NLP methods being used on like sort of the search sequence of like token output, and kind of steer it towards outcomes that would be unlikely otherwise. So like lots of different opportunities here, I think, for like how to control these things. All of them produce like texturally different interactions, which I think is really cool.
Thank you.
Hey there. I'm just curious, you're making all of these really cool tools for creators, and I'm wondering how much, if any, creator input, like basically you're making tools for poets. Did you talk to poets before you made the tool to help design it, or is it just after the fact?
Yeah, so this is something that varies a lot depending on which of these projects you're talking about. The poetry tool in particular is something where both I and Alex Calderwood, the PhD student leading that system, are computational poets, and so I think we were kind of drawing a lot on our own creative practice in like sort of making those interfaces. And in general, I tend to do things that are like, I have some personal creative practice and I want to build a tool that like elaborates on that or makes it more like sort of supported by like a wider range of people, basically. At the same time, I do think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in talking to experts who are in fields that you're not in yourself, and building tools for them. I tend to avoid making things for experts because they often really like the tools they're currently using, and so they don't really want to change their craft or like have an AI sort of intrude on the parts of it that they like. So a lot of what I do is much more shaped by like kind of these play potentials that I see where people are like engaging in some creative form but very casually or playfully, and in kind of like a low stakes way. So I think there's a lot of really interesting things you can do with like where you draw the initial creative practice seed from, whether that's your own work or someone else's like expert work or whatever. But mostly for me, it's been either like my own practice being elaborated into a system, or something where it's like I see people doing this fun thing and it'd be fun to like build a small tool for it.
Hi, great speech. I just have a more general question about Midjourney. I think at the beginning, Midjourney, you can only interact with Midjourney on Discourse kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And now you see people using ChatGPT, other platform to generate pictures. You say the most recent one is like Ghibli, like the version of picture. I wonder for Midjourney, what's the like ultimate goal for you guys? Is there any like ultimate business product you want to provide to the world that people can use? So yeah.
Totally, yeah. So I think different people would give very different answers to this question. My personal answer is that I think we're really interested in like interactive storytelling and like what the future of that looks like, especially kind of building these loops around. Once you've created a setting, can you like sort of create an interactive experience that then draws people into that setting and allows them to kind of behave like in open-ended ways where they like talk to characters and like sort of just say whatever they want to say or like walk around and go whatever they want to go. And start to kind of interactively build out that world into like a more and more detailed version of it as they sort of like experience that space. I think we're really interested in these kind of like collaborative, co-creative interactions, like playful interactions, et cetera. And especially kind of like these multiplayer scenarios of like lots of people creating together or like annotating a generative space collectively. I think, again, different people would give different answers to this question. And so like, I think we're also not super enthusiastic, though, about like building graphic design tools straightforwardly. That's something that's much more, I think, like commercially oriented and like a little bit less sort of in the spirit of like the artistic expression that we're trying to enable. What else? What else? I think that's basically all I have to say. But yeah, we can talk more about it afterwards.
For a long time now, I've sort of felt like Netflix was going to end up with effectively just AI-generated content. That you would go and say, hey, I like Heat, I like The Crow, or whatever. Give me a buddy comedy, like in the fashion of those or whatever. So how do you tell it like surprise me, but surprise me in a good way, and not surprise me in like the Lost Highway way, for example?
Yeah.
Where it's like this thing makes. I mean, don't surprise me so much that the story doesn't make any sense, but surprise me enough that like it surprises me within context or something like that.
Totally. So I think this is a thing where like generating long form content that's any good is still like a long way out. And so I'm not super like sure how to answer in the short term way. However, I'm also actually kind of like not sure that people are going to want these sort of custom experiences that are very long form in nature that are fully generated end to end. I think a large part of what you like in movies is actually being able to talk to other people about what's in the movie afterwards. And there's also like this sort of weird dynamic where as soon as you're prompting for a thing, you become the author who's responsible for that thing in some ways. And you don't actually want to watch back like a whole film to decide whether you want to like see that film again or share that film or whatever. So I think that the decision granularity loop kind of works against you in terms of like generating like a long form movie, for instance. I think there will eventually be longer form generation that's like more compelling, but how do you get there is not totally clear to me. And it's definitely going to involve some combination of like trying to draw in like wild outside inspirations while also trying to like sort of complete in sort of like a next token prediction style, like what's most likely to happen. And even in text, we haven't really solved this problem. So for like film, it's very unclear.
I'm really interested in this idea of understanding the user's intent and trying to like help the user move outside of that density that you saw. I'm wondering if you've thought about letting the agent or the LLM produce like a user interface to elicit this creative response that you want. Like, for example, making the LLM create that slider of like good and bad on either side.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is actually one of our big research questions right now. Like, how do you build these dynamic user interfaces that like elicit the right kinds of intent at the right kinds of times to make the interaction feel smoother overall? So like that's, I think, a really interesting open problem that we're going to be trying to solve.
Hey, you mentioned that you guys are using soft token prompt to drive the distribution of the diffusion model's output. So my question is, how exactly could you, as a human, you can control the soft token to drive the distribution in the output? And the second is like, how did you guys evaluate the output automatically so that you can scale up to the training?
Totally. So that was actually referring more to the toy teller interaction where we're generating text rather than images. But I think in general, the soft token stuff is best evaluated by training the adapter model to do like a simple mapping of like, here's the soft token to like, here's the output that you're looking for in sort of the traditional like sort of machine learning loop. And then building an interaction that makes it so that there's a relatively straightforward addition of soft tokens to the end of the prompt, as opposed to having it be like a thing where it's predominantly constrained on information that the user is not able to like sort of textually verbalize. This is like a very unsophisticated answer, so we can get more into it afterwards if you want, but yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.